John's was about the intellectual, 1967. I mean,
well, intellectuals is an interesting concept. I don't want to go on for too long, but the word intellectual in Western languages, in the current sense, you know, it really comes pretty much from the Dreyfus trial. Before that, I mean, there were people, intellectuals, but it wasn't a category of dissidents. At the Dreyfus trial, you had dissident intellectuals, Emile Zola, the Dreyfusards, and so on. But take a close look. They were a small minority, and they were persecuted. Zola had to flee the country. The mainstream intellectuals, you know, the immortals of the Académie Française and so on, they strongly supported the state and condemned the Dreyfusards for daring to criticize the majesty of the army and the state and so on. That's typical. There's very rarely an exception to that through history. Way back to periods, you know, take, say, the Bible. I mean, there were people in the Bible who were pretty much what we call intellectuals, and people who condemned the king for criminal acts, gave geopolitical analysis, charging them with threatening the population, calling for mercy for widows and orphans and so on. And we call them prophets. They had nothing, that's just a bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word. But they were what we would call dissident intellectuals. But how were they treated? They were imprisoned. They were driven into the desert and persecuted and denounced. There were intellectuals who were honored, the flatterers at the court. Hundreds of years later, they were called false prophets, not at the time. That continues right to the present. The term dissident in the United States and England refers specifically to critical intellectuals in enemy states, right? We don't call critical intellectuals in our client states dissidents, even though they're treated much more harshly than they were in Eastern Europe. So, for example, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the High Command of the Salvadoran government's U.S. client, close contact with the U.S. Embassy, ordered a brigade, the Atacado Brigade, to invade the university and murder 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals, among leading Latin American intellectuals, the Jesuit priests. They did. They blew their brains out. Do we call them dissidents? Does anybody even know about it? I mean, can you mention their names? You know, I mean, just imagine that this had happened in Czechoslovakia or something. I mean, probably had a nuclear war. But it happened in U.S. domain, so it just didn't happen. And this, I can go on and on with this, but if you take a look generally, the people who we call intellectuals, people, it's a funny category, but the people who are sufficiently privileged and have sufficient resources so that they can speak about, articulately about issues of public significance, roughly what intellectuals are. Overwhelmingly, they're supportive of power, state and private power, absolutely overwhelming. There's usually, in every country, some fringe of critical intellectuals. If they're in enemy states, we honor them. If they're in our own client states, we blow their brains out and forget about it. But that's pretty much the way it's been through history. Okay. There's a few exceptions, few and very interesting ones.
Which we can think about later, but I'm determined to get another round in. Okay. Can we stay another 5 minutes? Do you mind?